Hey guys, time for another quick tech. This is a guitar I built about 20 years ago. I'll be rewiring it with some custom switching in a future video, but here I'm going to do a drop fill in this huge chip that I've got in the finish. This is nitrocellulose lacquer on this guitar. It's probably the last guitar I actually sprayed with nitro back in the day, but I'm going to just use super glue for the fill. I don't actually have any nitro. In fact, I don't even know if you can buy small quantities of nitro lacquer in Australia anymore. And even if you could, a fill this thick in nitro will take weeks, maybe months, to fully cure and stop shrinking before you can level sand it and polish it. So first I'll clean it thoroughly with white spirit, let it dry, then give it a very quick spritz with accelerator, which is optional. Accelerator can affect the clarity of the fill, and it can also affect certain finishes, so use it with caution. In this case, I'll be sanding it within a few minutes instead of having to leave it for a few hours. In general, you can tint CA glue with acetone-based stains. They're often called spirit stains or dye stains. In Australia, we've got a product called Feast Watson Proof Tints, which work pretty well, but I actually have some Loctite 480, which is a black super glue. It's not really designed for this type of application. In fact, the black in it, I think, is the plasticizer in the glue, but it does sand up and polish quite well. I've used it like this before. It's not going to be a truly invisible repair. Aside from the difference in materials, this guitar actually has clear coat on it, but it's on the bottom side of the guitar and it should look a lot better than it does now. The Loctite 480 is a little bit thicker than standard super glue, but it will pool and run a little in a big fill like this, so I have taken the time to make sure the guitar is as level as possible. If I was to tint up some regular super glue, I think I'd use a gel super glue or a high viscous super glue for this sort of job for that reason. I'm just using a blunt toothpick there to push it into the edges. You have to work quickly here because already the glue is starting to cure from the bottom up. Once the glue's cured, you can pare the excess back by scraping it with a razor blade. You can put tape on either side of the razor blade to localize the scratches, but this whole side will get sanded and buffed, so I'm not terribly fussed by it. Let me turn the volume up for a sec. Ooh, that's a great sound, isn't it? You can feel that sound in your teeth. To be honest, I prefer to work with this little dual cut file that I have. I've owned this for many years. I don't know where I bought it, but I've kept it for this exact job. And if I can get it into a spot, then I usually prefer to use it. The tape on the end there and also on the handle is because sometimes I lay it on a flat surface and it stops the ends scratching the surrounding finish. The other advantage I have here is that I know just how thick the finish is because the chip went right through to the timber. So I know I've got plenty of finish to play with here and I'm not being overly cautious. I am taking care, of course, though. So once I've got the fill blended in with the file, I'll move on to the finer abrasives, wet and dry paper, and I know from experience that with 400 or even 600 grit, I can actually remove the scratches from that file. So I'll cut small pieces of, well, every grit or every second grit up to about 1500 or even 2000 and wet sand it with all of those. I probably should have put those papers in the water before I started the process because the longer they soak, really, the better they work. That's a thick piece of closed cell neoprene. It's really ideal for this sort of thing. It holds its shape, but it's flexible enough to get around the curves. You can buy it online. It's similar to the stuff they make mouse pads out of. As a side note, it also works really well as the foam under bass pickups. There's a real knack to wet sanding like this up through finer and finer grits. You really have to let the paper do the work. If you press too hard, you'll get tiny little clogs of finish rolling around underneath and making bigger scratches than the ones from the previous grit that you're trying to remove. Generally, I sand with wet and dry in swirls. When you sand back and forward, you tend to get scratches at the end of each stroke where the paper stops and changes directions. With wet sanding, the other thing I'd say is keep an eye on the paper. The tiniest little clog or mark on the paper, you've just got to throw it out. The stuff is really cheap. There's probably 50 cents worth of paper in this whole repair, so don't be afraid to discard it and replace it. Otherwise, you'll have to backtrack to coarser grits to chase a scratch you've made. Obviously wear safety specs when you use power tools, but especially a buffing pad because it will fling compound in all different directions and you definitely don't want a fine abrasive rubbing around on your eyeball. I'm going to use 2 compounds here, and you really need to use different pads with each compound, so I mark them up. That FC stands for fine cut, and later I think you'll see SR, which stands for swirl remover. That's probably a little bit too much compound for this little job. I really only need 1 or 2 drops. I'm also buffing further around the guitar. There was a couple of marks that I sanded out when I got to about 800 or 1200 grit when I was wet sanding. I've got the guitar resting on some non-slip matting, and then I've got it weighed down with that bag of lead shot, which I normally use for fretwork. If you're doing this sort of thing on a freshly finished guitar, you'll probably have to rethink that non-slip matting can actually print its pattern onto a finish that's not fully cured. I've got the drill on its low speed setting. That's mostly because this particular drill is just not that powerful, but also because with lacquer you have to be careful not to overheat it because you can kind of melt it. So I'll move on to the swirl remover, and it's really just the same deal. Keep the pad moving, don't use excessive force. And there it is, drop fill in black nitro with black super glue. Hope you enjoyed the video. Like, share, subscribe and all that stuff, and I'll see you in the next one.